The scream of the wind outside was nothing compared to the scream Luke Granger heard in his mind. Not again. He bolted upright in bed, sweat soaking through his old military t-shirt hand, instinctively reaching under the pillow for a knife that wasn't there for a war that had long since ended, except it hadn't. Not really. In the next room, his daughter coughed a dry, tight sound like crumpling paper. Ellie. Luke was on his feet in seconds, bare soles hitting the cold wooden floor of the cabin. He moved fast, trained fast. It had been years since Afghanistan, but some habits stuck like scars. And tonight, like too many nights, the snowstorm howled like the ghosts of men he couldn't forget. As he entered Ellie's room, moonlight filtered through the frost-laced window, illuminating her tiny body, curled beneath layers of wool blankets. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Luke knelt beside her bed, pulling out the battered green inhaler. He held it gently to her lips. 1, 2, 3, deep breath, baby girl. She obeyed, eyes half-lidded, trusting him in the dark like always. Outside, snow crashed against the glass like fists. Inside, a father held the weight of 2 lives. And somewhere, beneath the storm, engines were coming. If you believe one act of kindness can shift the course of fate, stay with this story. It's not just about snow and engines. It's about what happens when a man who walked away opens his door again. Luke Granger didn't talk much anymore. He didn't have to. Not up here in the Montana wilderness, where the trees were taller than promises and the silence was too thick to lie through. After leaving the Marines and burying his wife, he'd driven until the roads got narrow and the people stopped asking questions. He built the cabin himself, with his hands, with pain, with purpose. Just big enough for 2 beds, 1 wood stove, and 1,000 quiet regrets. Most days he chopped wood, fixed broken fences, brewed strong coffee, read the same 3 books. Ellie would draw near the fire, her favorite blanket around her shoulders, humming songs he didn't recognize, maybe things her mother used to sing. Most nights, he dreamed of things he couldn't fix, but tonight was different. Something was coming. He felt it in the way the wind shifted, less random, more rhythmic. He heard it faintly beneath the storm. Not thunder. Engines, motorcycles. Lots of them. And he hadn't seen a soul in 6 days. Luke stood on the porch, flannel shirt open over his thermal undershirt, breath clouding the freezing air. His boots creaked on the wood. Snow piled high on the railing. He gripped the edge of the post like it was a rifle. He didn't fear men, but he feared for Ellie. And for once, he feared what kindness might cost him. Inside, Ellie had fallen asleep again, the inhaler resting beside her tiny hand. Luke tucked her in one more time just to be sure. She was the only reason he kept breathing. When the engines got louder closer, he didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the past. An old Marine duffel, torn at the seams. He opened it and pulled out a single item, a faded photo of his wife in uniform, holding Ellie as a baby. He touched it once, then tucked it back. Whatever this was, he'd face it standing tall. 5 minutes later, the world was pure white fury. Snow whipped sideways across the clearing in front of the cabin. Then, like a curtain being drawn, dark shadows emerged. First, 2, then 5, then 10, then 20. Motorcycles idled in the storm, like steel beasts breathing cold fire. The lead rider removed her helmet. Luke blinked. A woman, maybe mid-30s. Dark hair in a tight braid, leather jacket dusted with ice. Her eyes met his across the storm. Sharp, steady, no fear. She stepped forward. The others remained mounted, disciplined, silent. "I know what this looks like," the woman said, voice clear over the wind. "But we're not here to rob you." She unzipped her jacket slightly, revealing a USMC patch. "We just need warmth, just the night. Then we're gone." Luke said nothing, until Ellie coughed again behind him. That sound, small, broken, real. He looked at the woman's eyes one more time. Then slowly, he stepped aside and opened the door. Inside, the wood stove roared. 20 bikers entered in near silence. No weapons drawn, no loud talk, just exhaustion and gratitude. One by one, they stomped off snow, removed helmets, glanced at Ellie curled in a blanket on the couch. The woman first to enter paused by the fireplace. "You have a daughter?" Luke nodded once. "She's why I let you in," he said flatly. The woman didn't respond with words. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a silver coin with the Marine's emblem etched deep into the surface. She placed it gently on the mantel. "For your trust." Luke stared at the coin, unmoving. The storm outside screamed louder, but inside the cabin, the air shifted. Not warm yet, but no longer cold. The wind slammed against the cabin like fists of ice. Luke stood near the door, his frame rigid, every muscle listening. His breath fogged the frosted window as he stared into the night, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 20 bikers now occupied the only sanctuary he'd built, with silence and sorrow. And the storm wasn't letting up. It was only getting worse. The woman with the Marine's coin, he didn't even know her name, sat quietly near the fire, unwrapping a scarf from her neck. Her eyes scanned the room, always calculating, always calm. She wasn't like the others. She moved like someone who'd had command before, not in a bar fight, but in something far more dangerous. Something like war. Luke felt it in her posture, strong spine, steady hands. That patch on her jacket hadn't been for show. She'd earned it. But who the hell were these people? He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the howling blizzard outside, or the eerie discipline inside. Ellie stirred on the couch, blinking at the crowd around her. Luke moved instantly to her side. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm here." Her eyes scanned the room, a forest of leather jackets, boots, gloves drying by the hearth. Then they landed on the woman. Raven, though Luke didn't know her name yet. The girl tilted her head, then surprised him. She reached for her drawing pad, the one she hadn't touched in months. A few feet away, the bikers spoke in hushed tones. Ryder Cole, broad-shouldered and stone-faced, whispered something to a younger man, missing 3 fingers on one hand. Another cleaned off his fogged glasses and opened a dented thermos of what smelled like black coffee. No one laughed. No one moved without reason. It wasn't the chaos of a gang. It was something else, survivors. Soldiers in denim. Luke turned toward the fireplace and locked eyes again with the woman. "You said just the night," he said, voice low. She nodded. "That's all we ask. What's your name, Raven?" "Raven Knox." He paused. "You're in charge. Depends who's asking." Luke's jaw tightened. He didn't have the energy for games. "I'm asking," he said. Raven offered a thin smile. "Then yes. Tonight I am." A loud crack outside made everyone freeze. The wind had blown the barn door open again. Luke reached for his coat. "I'll get it," he muttered. Before he could step out, a biker, maybe early 20s, long scar over his eye, moved toward the same coat hook. "I'll help," the man offered. Luke stopped him with a look. "You don't know that barn. It's old. Rotten beams. You step in the wrong spot, it'll crush you." The biker nodded and backed off. Luke stepped into the gale alone. Snow slapped his face like glass as he made his way to the barn. It stood crooked against the wind, groaning in protest. He wrestled the door shut, reinforced it with an iron bar, then stood for a moment, letting the cold burn his skin. It was grounding. Clean. Real. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. Tracks. Fresh ones. Deep. Coming from the woods. Not from the road. Not from the drive. His pulse quickened. They weren't tire tracks. They were boots. Back inside, Raven stood near the window watching for his return. When Luke came back and brushing snow off his shoulders, his expression had changed. "There's someone else out there," he said. Ryder stood up. "Someone from our group." Luke shook his head. "No, this one came from the tree line. Not your path." Raven's gaze darkened. We were followed. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a limp, let out a slow curse. "We lost contact with Mason 2 towns back," he muttered. "He might have tried to catch up, or—" Raven raised a hand. Silence returned. She looked to Luke. "You have weapons." Luke raised an eyebrow. "What kind of people do you think I am?" "The prepared kind." Luke didn't answer, but the tightness in his jaw said enough. Then, as if summoned by tension alone, a soft thud echoed against the cabin wall. Everyone turned. Another thud closer. This time, it rattled the shutters. Luke reached behind the cabinet and retrieved an old rifle. Bolt action. Oiled but dusty. Raven's hand moved to her waist, not for a weapon, but instinctively. Luke moved to the front door, peered through the peephole. Nothing but snow. Then, a shadow moved. He swung open the door and stepped onto the porch. Wind rushed in like a scream. There, collapsing into the snow, was a man, face frost-bitten, eyes wide with terror. Mason. Raven was behind him in seconds. Luke helped haul the man inside. He was barely conscious. His lips cracked. They're not far," who Luke asked, but Mason had passed out. Ryder helped strip the man of his soaked jacket, revealing a deep gash along his side. "Too clean for a branch," Ryder said grimly. "Knife?" Raven asked. Ryder nodded. Luke turned to Raven. "So you weren't just out for a ride?" Raven looked at him and didn't blink. "No," she said. "We were running." The fire crackled. Ellie sat on the couch again, quietly sketching the woman with the braid. Luke leaned on the doorframe, heart pounding. The storm outside had brought more than cold. It had brought secrets. And maybe something worse. The cabin had never held this many souls. It creaked under their presence, 100 tiny groans from the beams above, like the house itself was adjusting, wary, curious, not yet willing to trust. Luke sat near the fire, back to the wall, eyes scanning the room. He wasn't relaxing. He was reading. Body language, eyes, micro movements. These people weren't drunk. They weren't careless. They didn't slouch or shout or swagger. Even the way they laid out their jackets to dry followed a rhythm unspoken but disciplined, like a unit. He'd seen something like this before, in war zones, in recovery wards, in men who'd lost more than they let on. The man Mason was now sleeping in the far corner, bandaged and breathing color slowly returning to his frost-bitten face. Ryder had barely left his side. Every so often, Luke caught the bigger man glancing at Raven for reassurance, not approval, just steadiness. She hadn't spoken much since helping stabilize Mason. Instead, she stood near the old bookshelf staring at the only framed photo in the room. Luke's wife, hair like wildfire, smile like summer, holding Ellie as a newborn. Raven said nothing, but Luke noticed the subtle nod, the way her eyes lingered for just a second, longer than they needed to, as if she recognized something, or someone. He rose slowly, walking toward her, careful not to wake Ellie, who had finally dozed off again, her blanket tucked beneath her chin. "You knew her," Luke said quietly. Raven turned. Her voice came softer than he expected. "Only once. VA hospital, maybe a decade back." He felt his throat tighten. She was a nurse. Oncology. Raven gave a dry laugh. "I was in the ER. Shrapnel in my thigh, cracked, rib-infected burn. I was not a pleasant patient. She handled worse. She handled me." Raven looked back at the photo. She had a copy of Psalms tucked in her pocket. "Gave it to me when I was discharged. Said I'd need it before I wanted it." Luke stared. "You still have it." Raven reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn, creased object wrapped in black leather. She held it like something sacred. "I didn't know she was your wife until I saw the photo." Then it clicked. Silence stretched between them, uncomfortable, but not cold. She always said the people she met at that hospital were the real warriors, Luke murmured. "Then she was wrong," Raven said. "She was the strongest person I'd met." The moment broke when Ellie stirred again and sat up, blinking. Her voice was small. "Dad, who are they?" Luke crouched beside her, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "People caught in the storm like us. They just needed a warm place for the night." Ellie looked past him, and her eyes landed on Raven. "Her tattoo," she whispered. Luke turned. Raven had removed her outer jacket, revealing a black, long-sleeve thermal shirt. Ink curled out from beneath the sleeve wings. Not angelic and dainty, but sharp, powerful, spanning from shoulder to elbow. "She looks like Mom," Ellie said, almost too quietly to hear. Raven froze. Luke's chest ached in a way he hadn't allowed for years. "I miss her," Ellie whispered. "I know, baby girl." Raven approached, slowly crouching beside the girl. "I'm sorry you lost her," Raven said gently. Ellie blinked at her. "Did you know my mom?" Raven nodded. "She helped fix my leg when I thought it would never work again." Ellie studied her for a long moment, then reached under her blanket and pulled out a stub of colored pencil and a worn sketch pad. She flipped to a new page and started to draw. Later that evening, Luke stood near the stove, ladling soup into tin mugs. He moved with silent precision, every motion, efficient, reheated chicken, broth potatoes, a few shreds of carrot. Supplies weren't abundant, but they were warm. Ryder stepped up, accepting the soup with a grateful grunt. "Didn't expect hospitality." "You asked politely," Luke said. Ryder gave a short laugh. "You're ex-military Marine." Ryder smiled wider. "Knew it." "What gave it away?" "Your stove's cleaner than your boots. You surveyed us in under 10 seconds, and you've got the stare." Luke raised a brow, the one that says you've seen things, and walked away, but never really left. Luke didn't answer. Ryder took a sip of the soup. "This isn't bad. Ellie's recipe. Smart kid." Luke glanced over. Ellie sat cross-legged by the fire sketch pad, balanced on her knees, Raven beside her. The two hadn't spoken much since, but their silence was different. Not empty. Shared. Ryder followed his gaze. "She doesn't usually talk to strangers. Not since the hospital." "Ah." Luke didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. As night deepened and snow piled higher against the windows, the air inside the cabin grew thicker, not just with heat, but with something else. A fragile peace. One built on exchanged glances, small gestures, the clinking of tin mugs, and the soft crackle of firewood. Luke found himself watching Raven more than he should. She moved like someone trained, not just in war, but in grief. Her hand steady when touching Mason's wound, her eyes scanning every face like a leader who knew what it meant to lose those she led. But it was the way she sat beside Ellie, patient, present, listening, without trying, that left the deepest mark. At one point, Ellie turned her drawing toward her, a charcoal outline of raven wings, unfurled, crouching like a protector beside a child. Above them, tiny stars. Raven smiled. Not wide, not showy, but real. Luke leaned back in his chair, heart beating slower now. Maybe letting them in hadn't been a mistake. Maybe the storm wasn't the only thing breaking at the cabin's door tonight. Maybe something else was slipping in. Something warmer. The scream came fast, sharp, and all too familiar. Luke was halfway to the corner before he realized he'd moved. His body had reacted before his mind. Did reflexes honed in desert combat zones, now firing in a snow-laden cabin. The noise had come from Mason's corner. But what Luke found there wasn't noise. It was silence. Dead silence. Mason lay slumped on the floor, pale, drenched in sweat. His eyes rolled back, lips blue. Ryder knelt beside him, shouting something, words blurred by panic and desperation. Luke didn't wait. He dropped to his knees, scanning Mason's body like a battlefield casualty. Shallow breath, rapid pulse, skin clammy. The man was going into shock and fast. Clear the area. Luke barked, voice slicing through the cabin like a whip. The bikers, dozens of rough men and women who looked like they feared nothing, moved instinctively, scrambling backward, parting the space like a ripple in combat formation. Luke pulled off his flannel shirt and balled it under Mason's head. Blankets now. Someone bring me water, room temp. Not cold, I got it, Raven said, already moving. Her voice calm, not shaken, not surprised. Luke pressed 2 fingers to Mason's carotid artery, counting beats in his head. His body's crashing. He's dehydrated, lost blood, and the cold masked the signs. Could be internal bleeding, Ryder muttered, his voice strained. Could be, but if we panic, he won't make it 10 minutes. Raven returned with a first aid kit, a canteen, and a wet towel. I'll elevate his legs, she said. You trained combat medic. Fallujah, 2011. U-Camp Bastion. Trauma unit. 2 tours. They didn't need to say more. For the next 3 minutes, they moved like 2 hands of the same body, checking vitals, adjusting position, warming Mason's core, slowing his breathing, timing the fluids. Luke directed with clipped efficiency. Raven followed without resistance. They didn't speak unless necessary. Their eyes did the rest. The rest of the cabin watched in stunned silence. Ryder knelt, jaw clenched, helpless. A younger biker whispered prayers under his breath. Ellie stood near the back, arms around her sketchpad, eyes, wide not with fear, but awe, watching her father become someone she hadn't seen in a long time. Someone who still remembered how to save people. Breathing stabilizing, Raven said, finally placing 2 fingers under Mason's wrist. Pulse is slow, but steady. Luke let out a long breath and leaned back on his knees. I think he'll make it, he said. You bought him time, Raven replied. Luke shook his head. We both did. Their eyes met again. Not in victory, in something quieter, something harder to name. Ellie broke the silence with a single trembling word. Daddy Luke turned. She looked at him like she hadn't in months, not just as her father, but as someone bigger, someone braver. Are you okay? She asked. He nodded. Yeah, baby girl. I'm okay. She walked across the room and took his hand, just held it. Ryder stood, slowly clearing his throat. You didn't have to do that. Luke looked at him. Yes, I did. We've lost people before, Ryder said. No one here could have done what you did. Raven stood up beside Luke, brushing a lock of hair from her face. That's not true, she said. You stayed. Ryder glanced at her, then nodded. Later, when Mason was tucked into warm blankets near the hearth, and the adrenaline had finally begun to fade, Luke sat by the fire, stirring the coals with a metal poker. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the old, familiar edge of exhaustion that only came after holding life and death in your hands. Raven sat across from him, elbows on her knees, eyes on the flames. You don't miss it, she said suddenly. Luke didn't answer. The chaos, the choices, the noise. He stared at the fire. No, but I miss knowing who I was. You're still him. No, I'm not. Raven paused. You just saved a man's life. You haven't lost that part of yourself. Luke looked over at her. Sometimes saving people doesn't feel like victory. It just reminds you of who you couldn't save. The words hung in the air, heavy as the snow pressing down on the roof. Raven nodded slowly. Your wife. He nodded, Cancer. Late stage. We fought hard. But it wasn't a battlefield I could win. Raven's jaw tightened. I know that war, too. Luke glanced at her curious. My sister, she said. Same story. Same ending. They sat in silence again. But this time it wasn't empty. This time it was shared. Ellie wandered over, still holding her sketch pad. She stood in front of Raven Eyes, cautious, but kind. You're strong, she said softly. Raven smiled. So are you. Do you miss your sister every day? Ellie held out the drawing she'd finished during the chaos. It showed Luke kneeling beside Mason, hand steady, Raven beside him, light radiating from their palms. I don't draw sad things, Ellie said. Only what I hope is true. Raven looked at the image a long time. Then she pulled off one of her leather gloves and reached out. Luke noticed it, the scar on her wrist. Old, faded, but unmistakable. Not from combat, from pain. Raven took Ellie's hand gently. Thank you, she said. And something shifted in Luke, then, like a door inside him creaking open after years of rust and winter. That night, long after most had fallen asleep, Luke stood watch at the cabin window rifle leaning against the wall. The snow still fell. The woods were quiet, but his heart beat different. He'd let them in. And somehow, without knowing it, he'd let himself back in too. Morning didn't arrive with sunlight. It arrived with quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes after a storm has spent its rage. Snow coated the trees like powdered glass, and the world outside the cabin looked untouched, pristine, silent, innocent. But inside, the scent of coffee wood smoke and something warm simmering in the cast-iron pot spoke of life, of survival. Luke stirred the soup slowly, his sleeves rolled up, forearms taut with motion. It was nothing fancy, just potatoes, some beans, dried meat, and powdered broth. But after the night they'd had, it might as well have been a royal banquet. The fire crackled in the stove. The cabin, despite the crowd, felt strangely calm. He glanced over his shoulder. Raven sat beside Ellie, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. They weren't talking, but they didn't need to. Something had changed between them during the night. A softness had crept in, not weakness, but something gentler than steel. Ryder stepped up beside Luke with 2 metal mugs in hand. Smells like a good morning, he said, offering a half grin. Luke handed him a ladleful of soup. Could use more salt. We've had worse, Ryder replied. He took a sip and nodded. Definitely had worse. They stood there in companionable silence for a moment, watching as a few of the bikers began to stir. Some stretched near the fire, others sat with backs against the log walls, quietly sipping coffee from reused canteens. Ryder gestured toward the sketch Ellie had taped to the wall overnight, the one of Raven and Luke kneeling over Mason. She's got talent, he said. Luke nodded. Her mother was the artist. Ryder's eyes softened. You're doing good with her. That kind of quiet strength that doesn't come easy, especially for single parents. Luke looked away. You, a father, know. But I had one who tried. There was a pause. Then Ryder added, he didn't succeed. Luke gave a dry smile. Then maybe we both know what not to be. Raven approached quietly, a bowl of soup in hand for Ellie. The girl sat on a pile of folded blankets, her sketch pad open on her lap. She looked up as Raven knelt beside her. Want to eat together? Raven asked. Ellie nodded. Raven pulled her gloves off and settled in. Ellie scooted closer, close enough that their shoulders touched. For a girl who had retreated from strangers since her mother passed, it was more than trust. It was healing. Luke saw it, felt it, and in some part of himself he didn't want to admit existed. He felt grateful. Later, as Raven stood by the frosted window sipping from a tin cup, Luke joined her. They watched the morning light push timidly through gray clouds, reflecting off icicles like crystal shards. "She likes you," Luke said, nodding toward Ellie. Raven smiled faintly. "She reminds me of my niece. You have family had. My sister was raising her when she passed. I lost them both within the same year." Luke didn't speak. He knew better than to offer hollow comfort. Instead, he said, "Ellie hasn't drawn in almost a year." Raven looked over surprised. "No." Luke shook his head. "After the hospital visits, she closed up, stopped talking to strangers, refused to go near school. And now she's drawing you," he said. Raven took a slow breath. "She sees something in me. She sees strength. Not the kind that comes from a leather jacket or a tattoo. The kind she remembers from her mom." Raven was quiet for a long moment. "Then your wife must have been one hell of a woman." "She was." His voice softened. "She had this way of making people feel safe, like no matter how bad the world got home was still possible." Raven glanced at him. "That's rare. She saw the best in people, even when I couldn't." "You're starting to again," Raven said gently. Luke met her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't look away. As noon approached, the bikers began tending to their gear. One helped repair a cracked saddlebag. Another checked the frozen fuel lines outside. The storm had passed, but the cold remained, and they weren't moving anytime soon. Luke handed out another round of soup and watched as they gathered around a makeshift dining area, planks of wood balanced across crates. It was the first time laughter echoed in the cabin. Low, uncertain, but real. He stepped outside for air boots, crunching into fresh snow. The cold bit through his flannel, but he didn't mind. Sometimes a man needed to breathe where no one could see him exhale. He was about to head back in when he heard footsteps behind him. Raven. She didn't speak, just stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the sunlight drift across the treetops. He finally broke the silence. "You ever think you'd end up here in a stranger's cabin, with 20 bikers, a little girl who draws angels, and a Marine who makes soup?" She smiled. "No, not in 1,000 lifetimes." Luke chuckled. "Me neither." Then quieter, "But I'm glad you're here." Raven looked over at him, her face lit by pale winter light. "I am too." Back inside, Ellie taped another sketch beside the first. It was of Raven handing her a bowl of soup, warmth drawn in soft pencil lines, steam rising like threads of memory. Luke paused at the doorway watching the girl work. He'd built this cabin for silence, for distance, for grief. But now it held something else. It held voices, it held laughter. And for the first time since his wife passed, it held hope. The day wore on, cloaked in a deceptive calm. Outside, the Montana woods glistened under sheets of white sunlight, catching on snowdrifts like a magician's trick, making beauty out of stillness. But Luke knew better. Beauty wasn't always safe, and stillness didn't mean peace. Inside the cabin, warmth lingered in the walls. Soup had been served, blankets shared. A strange rhythm had settled over the group like a fragile truce. But no soldier forgets the sound of tension beneath silence. Luke watched the man near the back wall, Duke the one with prison ink crawling up his neck, and a limp that didn't match the weather. He'd been edgy all day, fingers twitching, jaw clenched tight. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't just riding out the storm. He was hunting something, or escaping it. Luke didn't move immediately. He didn't cause a scene. Instead, he quietly ran inventory in his head. Med supplies low water, stable fuel decent. But the cabin's medicine cabinet was vulnerable, and Ellie's inhalers were running short. Too short. He walked back to the loft to check the wooden chest near his bed. Empty. The backup inhaler he'd stashed 2 days ago was gone. His pulse sharpened. He moved fast, scanning the room below. Then he saw him Duke, half hidden near the far corner, hunched over hands tucked inside a duffel bag. Luke crossed the floor like thunder. "You steal from me." The voice came low, cold, unmistakably military. Duke looked up, startled. "I didn't take anything." Luke was already beside him. He yanked the bag open. Inside, gauze, 2 vials of antibiotics, a glucose injector, and Ellie's inhaler. Ryder was on his feet across the room, but Luke raised a hand. "Don't." The others froze. Ellie peeked out from behind her blanket, foot eyes wide. Luke gripped the inhaler in one hand, his stare locked on Duke. This would have killed her. "She's not even sick now," Duke started. Luke stepped forward, quiet fury in every line of his face. Asthma doesn't wait for permission. One wrong breath, one bad draft, and she's gone before the engine even starts. Duke glanced toward the door as if considering a run for it. Luke didn't raise a fist. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked to Ryder. "He's your man, Ryder." Stepped forward, disappointment lining his face like weathered scars. Not anymore. There was a long silence. The fire cracked behind them. "Strip your patch," Ryder said to Duke. The man froze. "What, you heard me?" Duke looked around, but no one came to his defense. Even the youngest Ryder stared at the floor. Slowly, with shaking hands, Duke pulled the biker vest over his head and dropped it on the floor. Raven stepped forward, picked up the inhaler, and handed it to Luke without a word. Then she turned back to Duke. "You get to stay inside the cabin tonight," she said flatly. "But you sleep near the door. You leave first thing in the morning. Alone." Duke didn't argue. He didn't speak. He just walked to the far end of the cabin and sat down, smaller than before. That evening, Ellie's breath turned shallow. It came without warning. No wheeze, no cough, just a sudden tight gasp, her shoulders straining for air. Luke was already at her side, inhaler in hand, but his fingers trembled. He hated this feeling. The helplessness, the reminder that some enemies couldn't be punched or reasoned with. He pressed the device to her lips. 1, 2, 3, he counted softly. She inhaled, coughed, tried again. Again, Raven said, kneeling beside him. Her voice was steady, calm. Small breath. "Good. Hold it." Ellie obeyed. Luke glanced at Raven. "You know how to save my niece once? Syria. Dust storm took her down in the back of a Humvee. No meds, no help. Just breath and prayers." Ellie's breathing began to slow. The strain in her shoulders eased. Raven touched her forehead, brushing back damp strands of hair. "You're okay now." Ellie nodded weakly, then surprised them both by leaning forward and resting her head against Raven's shoulder. Luke sat back, chest hollowed out from fear, but filled too with something deeper. Gratitude. Later, after Ellie had fallen asleep on the couch wrapped in 2 layers of blankets and Raven's jacket, Luke stepped outside. The sky was 1,000 stars wide. The storm had moved east. What remained was peace. He stood near the woodpile, rubbing his palms together, exhaling hard. Raven followed him out a few minutes later, arms crossed, boots crunching softly over snow. "She'll be okay," she said. "I know. You carry it like a soldier." Luke didn't answer. Raven continued. "You ever think about what the weight does all the time?" They stood in silence. Then Luke said, "You didn't have to help. Back there. With Ellie." Raven turned her eyes to him. "You didn't have to let us in." They looked at each other, 2 battle-scarred hearts wrapped in leather and grief. She took a step closer. For a moment, Luke almost reached for her hand, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he said, "Wolves don't always bite, but they remember who fed them." She smiled faintly, and who watched their back when the snow came down. Back inside the cabin, breathed slowly. The fire had dimmed, but warmth remained. Luke glanced at the bundle of blankets where Ellie slept, Raven's coat, tucked around her like a shield. Tonight, the danger had come from within, but so had the strength, and the bond forged through it all was just beginning to hold. It was deep night now, the kind that made the woods disappear, where even moonlight was afraid to touch the earth. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, glowing like a pulse beneath crumbling logs. Most of the bikers had turned in early, their bedrolls clustered in quiet corners, boots piled near the walls. Outside, snow continued to fall in fine, dry flurries, less storm, more whisper. A lullaby for the forgotten. Luke sat at the table, alone, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee gone lukewarm. His shoulders were tired, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his eyes refusing to soften. But inside, he was changing. Ellie slept soundly now, her breathing slow and even. The inhaler rested beside her like a sentinel. Raven had laid a folded towel under her head. Luke had seen it, though she didn't say anything. She was good at that, offering help without drawing attention to herself. Like she knew that sometimes the smallest kindness was the loudest kind of love. The soft rasp of metal against wood broke the silence. Luke turned his head. Raven stood near the hearth, dusting ash from something she'd just unpacked. A harmonica. It gleamed dully under the firelight, well-worn, its corners nicked, the engraving almost rubbed smooth. She held it like it was a memory. "You play?" Luke asked. Raven didn't answer immediately. Then she shrugged. "Used to." "Long time ago." He nodded toward the hearth. "You always carry one." She smiled, faint and sad. "My sister's. She used to say music was proof God hadn't given up on us yet." Luke leaned back in his chair. "That sounds like something my wife would have said." Raven looked at him, something flickering behind her eyes. Then slowly she lifted the harmonica to her lips. The first note was low, almost reluctant, a soft, trembling sound that wavered like breath on glass. But then it grew, mournful, gentle, familiar. Luke's chest tightened. It was a melody he hadn't heard in years, an old lullaby he used to whistle for Ellie when she was a baby. A tune he'd played once long ago on the same harmonica, when he taught it to his wife back in the early days, when her chemo was still working, and hope hadn't yet begun to rot. His hands clenched the mug tighter. "You know that song," he said. Raven nodded, still playing. The melody dipped and rose soft as memory. When she finally lowered the harmonica, the silence that followed was not empty, it was reverent. Luke's voice was a whisper. She played that for Ellie, every night. Said it was the one song that made her feel like home. Raven looked down at the harmonica in her palm. "I didn't know. I just found it in my bag after the hospital. I didn't remember packing it." Luke stood slowly. His movements were quiet, unsure. "You said you met my wife at the VA hospital." Raven nodded. "I was in bad shape, angry, lost. She didn't treat me like a case file. She sat with me for hours, listened. No judgment, just warmth." Luke smiled faintly. "That sounds like her." "I never forgot her face," Raven said. "Or her voice. She gave me this tiny leather Bible. Said it belonged to her husband when he deployed." Luke blinked. "My deployment Bible was stolen out of a rucksack in Ramadi." Raven looked up. "She said it found her. Maybe now. It's found its way back." The two of them sat down near the fire. Luke reached into a drawer and pulled out an old, crinkled photograph. He handed it to her. It showed a woman with sunlit hair holding a newborn Ellie. She stood in front of the VA hospital, a breeze lifting her hair, laughter caught mid-frame. Raven stared at it. "That's her," she said softly. "She brought me water and crackers. She braided my hair. And she told me I was more than what had been done to me." Luke's voice was thick. "She said that to a lot of people. but she meant it for every single one. For a while, they just sat in the hush, two survivors holding pieces of someone neither of them could let go of. Then Raven said, "After she passed, I didn't cry. Not really. I just kept moving, transferred out, joined a crew, tried to forget." Luke nodded. "I buried her on a Thursday. By Monday, I was in this cabin. You thought disappearing would protect Ellie?" "I thought disappearing would protect me," Luke corrected. Raven looked at him. "And has it?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, until 20 motorcycles showed up in a snowstorm. "Yeah, it worked," she laughed. A real laugh. Not loud, but warm. Luke looked at her. "You should play more often." Raven's gaze softened. "I might, if you whistle the next verse." Luke raised an eyebrow. "I haven't whistled in years." "You don't forget songs like that," she said. And so in a cabin built for silence, a harmonica sang again. Luke joined in quietly, at first, then stronger. Their music wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was honest. Across the room, Ellie stirred in her sleep and smiled without waking. Outside, the snow slowed to a gentle drift. Inside, two voices, one of breath, one of brass, spoke the same language for the first time. Not of grief, but of what comes after. It began as a low vibration barely there, like a whisper beneath the floorboards. Luke paused mid-step, the mug in his hand, trembling slightly. He glanced toward the window, toward the tree line now barely visible through the morning fog. Then came the sound. Not thunder, not wind. Something deeper, mechanical, rhythmic, growing. Engines. More than a few. Ryder stood near the cabin wall, still lacing his boots. His eyes snapped toward the door. "You hear that?" Luke nodded, jaw tight. "They're coming fast." The vibration deepened. Snow on the windowsills began to shift. The old wood-framed windows rattled gently like teeth in the cold. Raven was already moving, grabbing her jacket, scanning the room. Her voice was calm but urgent. "Everyone up. Now." Quietly. The bikers stirred fast and disciplined, pulling on gear, checking their tools, their bags. Not a single one panicked, but every one of them understood what this meant. They were being surrounded. Luke stepped onto the porch, first rifle slung low, not raised, but ready. The trees in the distance trembled, not from wind, from force, from mass. And then they appeared, one by one, then 10 by 10. Headlights, hundreds of them, cutting through the mist like spears of fire. The sound was a rolling avalanche, metal muscle and momentum echoing off the mountain like the growl of giants. Luke's breath caught. That's not 20. Ryder stepped beside him, eyes wide. "That's 500. They came in formation, disciplined, precise, like a military unit. Not chaos, not noise, power with purpose. And at the center, a dark figure on a massive bike, painted black with red chrome flames, licking up the side, led the charge. The insignia on the leather vests was unmistakable Hell's Angels. Inside the cabin, Ellie had woken. She sat up on the couch, still wrapped in Raven's coat. "Daddy." "What is it?" she asked. Luke turned slightly. "Stay inside, sweetheart, no matter what happens." He stepped out farther onto the porch, boots crunching over snow, hardened from the cold. Ryder moved beside him, teeth clenched. "This isn't a warning. It's a reckoning." Raven's voice cut through the tension as she stepped between them, her own boots planting firmly on the porch. "No, this isn't what you think," she said. Luke looked at her. "You know what this is," Raven nodded slowly, her voice steady. "I think I do." The engines began to cut one after another until the clearing was filled with the creaking groan of settling metal and a silence so thick it pressed on the ribs. From the front line, the massive rider dismounted. He removed his helmet, slowly revealing a face marked by years, grizzled beard, piercing gray eyes, a long scar down his jaw. His presence wasn't loud. It was still. The kind of still that carried weight. He scanned the cabin to the people on the porch, the woman standing between them. Then he spoke, voice low and gravel-worn. "Where is she?" Raven stepped forward, hands, visible calm. "I'm here, Damien." A breath passed, then another. The man's expression shifted not to anger, but to something harder to name. He nodded once. "So it's true." Luke's eyes flicked between them. "You know him?" Raven didn't take her eyes off Damien. "This is Damien Cross, National Commander, leader of the Hells Angels Northwest Chapter." Ryder muttered. "And he's here." Raven took another step forward. "He's not here to burn the place down. If he wanted to, he would have done it already." Luke folded his arms. "Then what's 500 of his men doing circling my cabin?" Damien's gaze turned to Luke, and when he spoke, it was quieter, more personal. "I came to thank the man who saved my brother's life." Luke blinked. "What Mason Damien said. My kid brother, the one who stumbled into your cabin half dead." Luke felt something shift inside. He was a good kid, Damien continued. Never had the stomach for this life, always trying to prove himself. I sent him on one run. One. And he got caught in a whiteout. He stepped closer, boots crunching snow with the weight of grief. If not for what you did, he wouldn't be breathing. Luke didn't speak. He wasn't sure what to say. Damien turned back to Raven. "You vouched for them." She nodded. "I did." Damien looked over the whole group, then back to Luke. "Then that's good enough for me." He pulled a leather glove from his jacket, dark brown, aged fingers slightly torn. He extended it toward Raven, then nodded toward Luke. "She should give this to you." Luke took the glove, slowly turning it over. The stitching was old, but still intact. On the inside cuff, a faded brand was burned into the leather. Marines. His breath hitched. He knew this glove. Years ago, during a training op in Fallujah, a younger Marine had lost his gloves during a sandstorm. Luke had given him his backup pair, refusing to take them back. He never saw that kid again, until now. Raven spoke softly. That boy was Damien's cousin, and he never forgot. Luke stood frozen. The glove in his hand was stiff from age, but warm from meaning. Damien stepped back toward his bike. "You let in 20 of my family. You saved one of my blood. That kind of thing don't get ignored." Then turning over his shoulder, he added one final line. "You opened your door in a storm. Now 500 of us are here to make sure no one ever slams one in your face again." Engines didn't roar this time. They hummed, a low protective hum, as if 500 men had become a wall of steel. Not against Luke, but for him. Raven stepped beside Luke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you, this wasn't what you thought." Luke looked down at the glove, then at her, then toward the horizon where sunlight was beginning to break through the trees. His voice was quiet. "I think I finally believe you. There was no celebration, no fist bumps, no rowdy cheers, no bottles clinking in triumph, just stillness. The kind that settles in when men who carry ghosts recognize their own in another." Luke stood near the cabin's porch, the worn Marine's glove still in his hand, the scent of aged leather and diesel lingering in the cold air. The snow around them had been trampled into a sea of boot prints and tire tracks, but somehow the land felt honored, like something sacred had taken place. Damien Cross stepped forward again, not as a leader commanding 500 bikers, but as a man paying a debt too long unspoken. "My brother Mason," he began, voice steady, "was the best of us." Luke stood tall, arms crossed over his chest. He wanted to earn his patch, I told him he didn't need to prove anything, but he was stubborn. Wanted to be more than the kid everyone thought couldn't hang. Ryder stepped forward now, standing silently beside Luke. He made it 2 states before the storm hit. Damien said, eyes far off now. Took a wrong road. Got ambushed. Would have bled out in the woods if your people hadn't pulled him in. Luke shook his head. We didn't do it for a favor. Damien met his gaze, eyes flint hard. That's exactly why it matters. Raven stood just behind them, her arms folded, jaw tense. But Luke noticed her expression shift, less guarded, now more watchful. Like a soldier in retreat, not from defeat, but from the need to always be on alert. Damien turned toward her. When you disappeared 2 years ago, I figured I'd hear news of your death before I saw your face again. I had to leave, Raven said. Too many memories. Not enough forgiveness. You left a hole behind, he said simply. Raven nodded. I was bleeding too much to fill anyone else's. The two shared a long look. Then Damien stepped closer and placed his hand over her shoulder. Not heavy, not demanding. Just enough. You've still got family, Raven, even when you forget. Her throat bobbed once, and for a heartbeat, she looked 10 years younger. Then Damien turned back to Luke. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. Thick. Old. With edges soft from wear. He handed it over. What's this? Luke asked. Something your wife gave me years ago. I met her once, at a VA benefit. Didn't even know she was married until later. Luke opened the envelope with care. Inside was a letter, handwritten in looping, careful penmanship. To the man who saved my husband. Luke froze. It was dated nearly a decade ago. Damien continued, voice rough. She said, you never liked praise. That you didn't know how to sit still long enough to let someone thank you. So she gave me this, and told me to deliver it, only if something ever happened to her. Luke read, eyes tracing every word like a prayer. If this reaches you, it means you met the man I married. The man who taught me what strength looked like, and what grace under fire truly meant. If he saved your life, then I know you were worth saving. Please don't let him forget who he is. Don't let him build a world too small for his heart to live in. And tell him Ellie will always need him to be brave, not just strong. Luke's hands trembled. No tears came. Not yet. Just silence. The air seemed to hold its breath. Damien stepped back and gave a small nod. That's all I came for. Luke looked up. What now? You opened your door when most would have bolted it shut. Damien gestured toward the vast line of riders behind him. So we figured we'd leave something behind too. He waved his arm once. From one of the tailing bikes, a man approached with a folder. Inside it, documents notarized and crisp. Your mortgage, cabin's cleared, Damien said. We handled it. Luke blinked. What also? Damien added school tuition fund for your daughter. Prepaid, 5 years out. Luke stood frozen. I don't accept handouts, he said. Damien's eyes narrowed. Good. This isn't a handout, it's a payment, Ryder said behind him. Voice calm. Not for the soup, not for the roof, for the choice to care when you didn't have to. Raven stepped beside Luke, now placing her hand gently over his forearm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he looked down at Ellie, who had wandered onto the porch in her fuzzy boots, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She blinked at the sea of motorcycles, at the mountains of leather and chrome and bearded men with scars and patches. Are they here? For us, she whispered. Luke crouched beside her and placed the Marine's glove in her tiny hands. No, he said. They're here because kindness echoes farther than fear. Damien Cross raised his hand in a slow salute, not military, but reverent. One by one, the rows of riders followed leather-clad arms, lifting in solemn unity. Not noise, not violence, just respect. And in that moment, Luke understood something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He wasn't alone. Snow had begun to melt by late afternoon, but the cold still clung to the pines. The sky had cleared, revealing a sun that broke timidly through clouds, as if asking permission to shine again. Inside the cabin, the quiet was no longer tense, it was reverent. The kind of quiet that followed something sacred. Luke sat at the wooden table, still holding the manila folder Damien had left. Inside were documents confirming the impossible his mortgage cleared. His cabin no longer under the grip of the bank. His daughter's school fund real verified and paid forward 5 years into the future. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt stunned. Like a man digging trenches his whole life, only to find someone had quietly built him a bridge. Ryder leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Luke with the same wary respect he'd given him since the night Mason was saved. "You still look like you're waiting for the punchline," Ryder said. Luke looked up dry. "That's because I've never seen a biker gang act like the Make-A-Wish Foundation." Ryder let out a breath, half chuckle, half sigh. "Yeah, well, guess miracles come in leather sometimes." Luke thumbed through the envelope again, then glanced toward the fire, where Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully stringing beads onto a length of twine. She hadn't stopped smiling since morning. He didn't want to ask, but the words came anyway. "Why me?" Ryder shrugged. "Because when 20 soaked strangers knocked you open the door, you didn't ask who we voted for, where we'd been, what we carried. You just made soup and cleared space on the floor." "That shouldn't be rare," Luke murmured. "No," Ryder agreed. "But it is." The front door creaked open, and Damien reappeared, flanked by 2 bikers, who wheeled in a small wooden crate. Luke raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me that's more paperwork," Damien smirked. "No. This one's a little more old school." One of the men popped the lid off. Inside were stacks of firewood, each log meticulously carved with initials. Beneath the top layer was canned food medical supplies, a spare generator, a sealed first aid pack, and something else wrapped in canvas. Damien reached in and pulled out a handcrafted plaque, iron-forged and oak-framed. At the top, engraved in block letters, Semper Fidelis, and below it, something even more powerful. In a world that shuts its doors, one man remembered how to open his. Luke's throat tightened. Damien offered the plaque. "We leave these behind when we've decided someone's one of us. You're not patched in Granger. Don't worry. We're not asking for that. But you've got something harder to earn." Luke took the plaque slowly, his hands trembling just a little. Damien nodded once. Respect. A quiet tap on the floor caught their attention. Ellie had walked over, holding something in her small palm. It gleamed faintly in the firelight. It was the old keychain Luke's wife used to keep on her hospital bag, an oval disc of tempered steel engraved with the Marine Corps emblem and the motto, Semper Fi. She held it up to Damien with wide, curious eyes. "This was my mommy's." "Do you know what it means?" Damien bent to one knee. "It means," he said gently, "you never leave your own behind." Ellie tilted her head. "Are you Daddy's own?" Damien blinked, then smiled. "We are now." He handed her something in return, a patch. Not one from his vest, but something rarer. A white cloth insignia, a dove holding an olive branch surrounded by a circle of flames. Luke narrowed his eyes. "That's not your usual badge." Damien nodded. "We carry that for peacekeepers. People who protect without drawing first. Only 4 people in the crew have ever earned it." Ellie clutched it tight, then ran to show Raven. Luke stood in stunned silence. After a while, the bikers began to ready their departure. Helmets strapped, engines warmed, wheels aligned like cavalry. But no one rushed. They moved like men who understood they were leaving something behind and taking something deeper with them. Before climbing onto his bike, Damien turned to Luke one last time. "One more thing," he said. "If ever you need help anywhere, anytime, just show that plaque. Doesn't matter if you're in Montana or Miami. Someone will answer." Luke nodded slowly. "Why, because the world's full of closed fists and locked gates," Damien said. "But now and then, someone reminds us that doors open too." Raven lingered by the porch, her gloved fingers wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. She watched the engines hum to life one by one as the riders prepared to roll. "You thinking of leaving with them?" Luke asked quietly. Raven didn't look at him right away. "No," she said. "Not this time." Luke's eyebrows lifted. "I've rebuilt houses in 6 states," she said. "Burned bridges in twice as many. Always ran when things got quiet. Because that's when the memories got loud." She looked over at him, eyes steady. "But this time, I don't feel like running." Luke nodded. "Good. Because I don't feel like being alone anymore." Raven gave him a long look. Not a romantic one. Not yet. But real. Earned. As the final rider turned onto the snowy road, Ellie came bounding up to the porch, holding the patch, the keychain, and the plaque like sacred treasures. "Daddy," she whispered, "can we hang this plaque above the door?" Luke knelt beside her. "Why, baby girl?" She smiled. "So no one forgets what you did." He hugged her, holding her close. "No," he said softly. "So I don't forget what they did?" Outside, the rumble of 500 engines faded into the mountain's breath. But inside, something louder remained. Gratitude, honor, and the quiet roar of a life no longer owed, but given back. The cabin had stood for 16 winters, built with Luke's bare hands and pain-soaked resolve. He'd carved every beam, sealed every crack, raised it like a shield between his daughter and the world. But now, it was no longer just his shelter. It was theirs. The sound of hammers came before sunrise. Not frantic, not industrial, rhythmic, purposeful. Like a heartbeat returning to a long-abandoned home. One by one, riders who hadn't yet rolled out began working. Not because they owed him anything, but because that's what respect looked like when it was real. They patched the holes in the roof first. Then reinforced the porch. Then someone wheeled in a second-hand generator, rewired the stove to support emergency backups. By midday, the front yard looked like a construction site, but without shouting, without orders. Barked. Just silent unity in denim leather and grit. Luke stood on the porch, arms folded, coffee cooling in his hand. He watched a man he didn't know chop firewood with surgical precision, while another repaired a section of the chicken coop that had collapsed last season. A third biker with tattooed hands was hauling bags of salt toward the back path. Raven approached from behind, snow brushing off her boots, Ellie walking beside her with a tiny shovel and a serious expression. "She's been inspecting," Raven said, half smiling. Luke looked down. "You a foreman now, kiddo?" Ellie gave a proud nod. They fixed the woodpile. And Ryder said I could help paint the new coop. Luke arched a brow. "You sure it's not just an excuse to spill paint on your boots?" Ellie grinned. "Maybe." By early afternoon, something remarkable began to take shape. A second wood stove was installed in the back room, the one Luke had long given up on insulating properly. New windows arrived in the back of a truck, and someone no one quite knew who had delivered a full pallet of non-perishable supplies stacked neatly on the porch. Luke walked out front to find a man measuring the fence line, casually scrawling notes on the back of a diner napkin. "You planning something?" Luke asked. The man nodded. "Raised beds. Ellie said she wants to grow strawberries." Luke paused. "She told you that right after telling me she wants a tire swing and a duck." Luke laughed for the first time in days. God help me, we might end up with both. But the moment that stopped him, cold, came later. Ellie had wandered toward the edge of the property, Raven trailing just behind. The girl knelt in the snow, fingers brushing across the cold earth near the roots of an old pine stump. "What's she doing?" Luke asked, stepping down from the porch. Raven looked at him. "She said she wants to plant something." "Now, in this snow," she said, and I quote, "It's not about now, it's about later." Luke walked closer, watching his daughter scoop a tiny trench into the frozen dirt with her mittened hands. "What are you planting?" Elsie held up a tiny seedling wrapped in cloth. "A Christmas pine," she said proudly. "So next year it'll already feel like home." Luke's breath caught, not because of the seed, but because of her word. Home. She hadn't used that word in months, not since her mother passed. Raven knelt beside Ellie and gently helped her dig. She said nothing grand, nothing ceremonial, just helped. Luke watched as the two pressed the roots into the earth, their hands working in tandem, mitten and glove, scar and innocence. When they finished, Ellie stood back and gave a satisfied nod. "Someday," she said, "this tree will be big enough for lights." "And a star," Raven added softly. Luke felt something shift in his chest. An ache that had once been grief now tugged in a new direction. He didn't speak. He just reached out and gently brushed a fallen snowflake from Raven's braid. That evening, the final touches were made. A new coat of red paint on the front door, a repaired weather vane spun gently on the roof, and on the inside wall above the fire, the wooden plaque Damien had left was mounted in place, framed by pine. Semper Fidelis. In a world that shuts its doors, one man remembered how to open his. Beneath it, Raven had added a note in chalk. "Welcome home, Ellie." As night fell, the remaining bikers packed their gear and made their quiet farewells. Some offered a handshake, others a silent nod. A few left behind tools and canned goods without a word. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, only a handful remained, including Raven. She stood outside watching the final motorcycles vanish down the road, their red taillights fading like embers. Luke joined her. "You sure you want to stay?" he asked. She turned to him. "I've spent years helping rebuild broken places, but I've never stayed to see what it looks like when something grows." Luke tilted his head. "And here. This time I want roots." He studied her face in the soft light of the cabin window. "You've already planted them," he said. She smiled. Inside, Ellie hung her newest drawing near the fireplace, a cabin in the snow surrounded by motorcycles. In the foreground, a little girl planting a tree. Behind her, two figures standing close, holding a small star. That night, as the fire cracked and the wind grew still, Luke lay awake in bed, listening. Not for danger, not for ghosts, but for the sound of breath. Ellie's, Raven's, his own. Together, finally. The snow fell again that morning, not with fury, but with grace. Fine powder drifted from the heavens, like a benediction, softening the scars in the land, sealing what had been rebuilt with a kind of quiet reverence. The cabin no longer stood alone. It stood blessed. Luke stepped onto the porch in his flannel shirt and boots, coffee in hand. It was the last day. The last day the riders would be here. They had done what no contractor, no loan, no government grant ever could. They had taken a weather-beaten cabin and turned it into a living testament to kindness, to loyalty, to the strange, hard-edged grace that sometimes wore leather and rode on chrome. They lined up in silence, all of them, shoulder to shoulder astride their motorcycles, 500 strong, engines quiet, helmets resting on handlebars, jackets, zipped patches worn with pride. It looked more like a military formation than a biker departure. Luke stood at the top of the porch stairs, Ellie beside him, bundled in her red scarf and navy coat. Her hand slipped into his. She looked out at the sea of riders with wide, reverent eyes. Raven stood a few steps behind them, her expression unreadable. But her presence was an anchor. She wasn't just watching them leave. She was choosing to stay. Damien Cross stepped forward, first his boots crunching over the snow. He didn't speak right away, just looked at Luke, looked at the girl, looked at the cabin. Then he nodded. "You gave us warmth," he said. "We give you honor." Behind him, a biker stepped forward. Large, frame, bald head eyes hidden behind mirrored glasses. He carried something wrapped in weathered cloth. He placed it in Damien's hands. Damien turned to Ellie, his voice lowered. "This is something we don't give out. Not to strangers, not to politicians, not to names in the papers." He knelt one knee to the ground and slowly unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a single leather glove, brown, worn. The word Marines burned into the cuff in deep block letters. But this one was different from the glove Luke had been handed earlier. This one had something else, a faint inscription along the inner lining. "Not all warriors carry rifles. Some carry daughters." Ellie looked up at Luke. He couldn't speak. His throat was stone. Damien held the glove out. "This belonged to my cousin, the one you gave your spare pair to in Fallujah. He carried it until the day he died. Said the man who gave it to him saved more than just his fingers." Luke's voice, when it came, was rough. He was just a kid, and you gave him protection when the world offered him none. Damien said, "This glove is yours now. Or, rather, hers." He handed it to Ellie. Her fingers closed over the leather carefully, like she knew this was more than a keepsake. It was a vow. Then it happened. One by one, starting from the front row, each rider raised their right arm and placed a gloved fist over their heart. Not loud, not showy, but unified. A wall of leather and steel saluted the little girl on the porch. No horns, no cheers, no engines. Just 500 men and women who had ridden through storms and sin, offering a gesture older than words. A leather salute. Ryder stepped forward next, removing his jacket. He held it for a moment, then extended it to Luke. "I can't take your patch," Luke said. "It's not a patch," Ryder replied. "It's a promise. The lining's got your initials stitched in now. We figured you earned it." Luke took it with both hands. Inside, under the cloth, was a small, stitched circle, the same dove insignia Damien had given Ellie. Luke looked up. "Thank you." Ryder gave him a rare smile. "You know, I never thought I'd say this to a guy who handed me soup, but you'd have made a damn good road captain." Luke laughed, and for the first time it was full. Open. Healing. "I think I've got my hands full just being a dad," he said. The line of riders began to move. Engines roared to life one at a time, like the clearing itself was waking up. Tires crunched over snow exhaust, curling into the sky like incense from a sacred rite. But no one peeled out. No one revved recklessly. They rode slow, deliberate. Each rider passed by the porch, making eye contact with Luke, with Ellie, with Raven. Some tipped their helmets. Others reached out a hand in silent farewell. Every single one of them nodded, as if to say, "You are one of us now." Ellie waved, holding the marine glove close to her chest. Her cheeks were pink with cold, but her eyes glowed with something warmer than fire. She whispered, "Are they gone forever?" Luke looked down the trail of tire marks stretching into the woods. "No," he said. "They just ride where they're needed most." Raven stepped closer, sliding her hand into his. "Will we ever see them again?" Ellie asked. Luke smiled faintly. "Maybe. But whether we do or not, what they gave us stays." He turned to look at the plaque over the door. Semper Fidelis. That night, after the snow settled and the rumble of bikes, was nothing but a memory. Luke lit the lantern above the porch. It cast a golden glow over the fresh red door, the newly built porch steps, and the tree Ellie had planted with her bare hands. Above it all, the plaque gleamed, and beneath it in chalked letters, Raven had written, "Once strangers. Now, family." Snowflakes danced through the dusk like whispers, light and slow, settling gently on the pine branches outside. Smoke curled from the chimney soft against the indigo sky, carrying the scent of cedarwood, and something sweeter, something healing. Inside the cabin glowed, not just from the firelight, but from the laughter, the warmth, the presence of life returning. The kind of warmth that couldn't be measured by degrees, but by belonging. Luke sat in the armchair near the hearth legs, stretched out a flannel blanket across his lap. Ellie curled beside him, fast asleep. She held the marine glove in her hands like a talisman, her fingers gripping it even in dreams. He watched her for a long time, letting the silence settle deep into his bones. But this silence was different. It wasn't emptiness. It was peace. Raven stood by the window, hands tucked into the pockets of her jeans, hair down, now loose around her shoulders. The faintest smile touched her lips as she looked out at the small tree Ellie had planted days earlier. A soft wind passed. The tree swayed gently. Fragile, yes, but rooted. Like all of them. Luke rose, carefully covering Ellie with the blanket. He moved to stand beside Raven, their shoulders brushing. "The tree's holding," she murmured. He nodded. "She checks it twice a day. Said she wants to put lights on it next Christmas." Raven turned to him. "Then I guess I'd better stay long enough to help her hang them." Luke looked at her. "You're really staying?" "I am," she said, voice steady. "Unless you want me gone." He shook his head slowly. "You're not just welcome here. You belong here." A long pause. "Then I buried my heart with the woman I loved," he whispered. "Thought that was the end of it. But these last few days, with Ellie with you, it's like I'm hearing it beat again." Raven reached for his hand. "And it's strong," she said. "Stronger than you think." They walked out onto the porch together, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The stars above them blinked like silent witnesses, and the plaque over the door shimmered softly in the lantern light. Luke ran his hand along the wooden frame. "I spent years building this place like a fortress. Thought if I kept the world out, I'd protect her. Protect me." Raven leaned into his side, and then 20 strangers broke through. He chuckled. "No." I opened the door. That's even braver. Behind them, Ellie stirred and wandered onto the porch, and her socks blanket wrapped around her like a cloak. "Is she staying, Dad?" she asked sleepily. Eyes on Raven. Luke looked down at her, then back at Raven, his voice low and sure. "She is, if she wants to." Raven didn't answer with words. She simply reached down, took Ellie's other hand, and held it. The three of them stood together in the soft snowfall, no longer a broken man and his fragile daughter, no longer a runaway soldier. Now, a family. They sat by the fire later that night, the room filled with quiet light and crackling warmth. Luke poured tea into chipped mugs. Raven stitched a loose thread from Ellie's scarf. Ellie read aloud from her sketchbook pages, filled with drawings of trees, motorcycles, stars, and one she'd labeled "The Night the Wolves Didn't Bite." Luke smiled at that one. "Did you draw this?" he asked. Ellie nodded proudly. "That's you. That's Raven. And that's the big man with the glove and the growly voice. You mean Damien?" "Yeah." "He wasn't scary at all." Luke raised an eyebrow. "That's not what your eyes said when he first stepped off that bike." Ellie giggled. "Well," he smiled eventually. Raven added, "You should have seen him when you weren't looking. He cried a little when he saw you holding that plaque." Ellie's eyes widened. Really, Luke met Raven's gaze. Even wolves have hearts. Later that night, as Raven cleaned up the dishes, and Ellie drifted to sleep with her arms around her sketch pad, Luke pulled out a long-forgotten item from a wooden box near the hearth. A harmonica. Not Raven's, not his daughter's. His. He held it, fingers trembling slightly. The last time he'd touched it was the day before the funeral. He'd tried to play but couldn't finish a note. The grief had been too thick, the air too heavy. But now he lifted it to his lips. The first note cracked, unsure. The second wavered. But the third was true. Raven turned in surprise, then smiled. She didn't join in. She just listened. The melody was simple, soft, familiar. A lullaby without words. And as it filled the cabin, Ellie's lips curled into a sleepy smile. Luke played until the fire turned to coals, until the night held no more fear, until his hands felt steady, and the music became memory. Outside, the snow fell slower now, a calm after the storm. Inside, a cabin once built to keep the world out, now welcomed it in. And though the road would remain long, uncertain, and winding, they would walk it together. 1,000 engines once came to his door, but one woman stayed, and the silence finally left. Where are you watching from today, friend? We'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in from. Let us know in the comments your stories, your hometowns, your memories. They matter here. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel. Every click of that button helps us bring more stories of hope, kindness, and second chances to people who need them most. And from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and remember, sometimes a single open door can change everything.